as President Donald Trump's immigration policies take shape and deportations take place across the country, there are questions about whether Democratic states will comply. Just so I'm clear, there are jurisdictions who have said that they will not cooperate with ICE. So have you directed them to reverse those decisions and what that will look like?
If I'm working trying to arrest MS-13 members and I'm trying to reach out to a local county gang unit, so your recommendation is that we don't work with a county gang unit to try to make the area safer?
I'm going in depth on the issue, pressing elected leaders on all levels of government to try and figure out how Maryland will move forward. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Fox 45 News In Depth. I'm Mackenzie Frost. It has been less than 2 weeks since President Donald Trump took office. In that time, he has signed a slew of executive orders on immigration. Some of his actions include allowing immigration officers to enter sensitive locations like schools and churches, mass deportation, stopping the process of migrants and asylum seekers, and an attempt to end birthright citizenship, which a judge has since paused. ICE agents have made thousands of arrests in cities across the nation, including places like Chicago, Philadelphia, and here in Baltimore. Those deportations drawing mixed reaction on Capitol Hill.
If you are an individual, a foreign national, who illegally enters the United States of America, you are, by definition, a criminal.
If they are indeed criminals, yeah, they're going to be shipped back to their country of origin.
What Donald Trump is doing now is that he's causing chaos rather than addressing those things.
They're going after people who are law-abiding, who are holding down jobs, who may have been here for a decade or 2 decades.
The national conversation sparking heated debate over immigration here in Maryland as well. We begin with a look at the state of immigration policy within the state. While Maryland is one state, all the different jurisdictions can have different policies for handling immigration enforcement. On the books now, there is not a blanket policy requiring cooperation with U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. But there is a law passed by the General Assembly in 2021 dictating some aspects.
My expectation would be that local leaders follow the law as it exists, and that they do it in a way that is humane and thoughtful. I would not expect them to break the law when it comes to immigration enforcement.
Senate President Bill Ferguson echoing what we've heard from Governor Wes Moore.
We have to have greater sense of clarity and leadership when it comes to fixing the immigration system. That has to come from Washington, D.C. We are going to follow the Constitution here. We're going to make sure that our local jurisdictions are following the Constitution. And we are going to make sure, as we already have been doing, making sure that for violent offenders, we are cooperating to ensure that, that we are getting violent offenders off of our streets and out of our neighborhoods, frankly, regardless of where they come from. We have to make sure we keep our community safe.
But when pressed on what exactly he wants local leaders to do, the governor is not incredibly clear. Just so I'm clear, there are jurisdictions who have said that they will not cooperate with ICE. So have you directed them to reverse those decisions?
Our local jurisdictions need to follow the Constitution. Period and full stop.
Later, Attorney General Anthony Brown issuing new guidance for local and state law enforcement, telling them they cannot extend detentions to investigate immigration status, may share status of individuals, but it's not required, cannot share personal information with federal immigration officials without a warrant, are prohibited from asking about immigration status during routine police work unless it's relevant to the probe, adding, quote, the federal government cannot compel state and local law enforcement to enforce immigration laws. But the updated guidelines,
It seems more politically motivated than legal guidance to me.
Met with concern from Matthew Elliston, Maryland's ICE director, while noting AG Brown is accurate that federal agents cannot force immigration compliance. Elliston says he's left wondering why the top law enforcement agent in Maryland wants to keep ICE out of jails.
This is guidance, and that's a recommendation. He feels that we shouldn't. The one thing I will say is, if I'm working trying to arrest MS-13 members and I'm trying to reach out to a local county gang unit, so your recommendation is that we don't work with a county gang unit to try to make the area safer? That seems like bad public policy and terrible for public safety.
The AG's office also providing guidance surrounding immigration enforcement at healthcare facilities. If an immigration officer shows up, the Attorney General's office says staff should record officers' credentials and contact an attorney, not disclose patient information unless shown a warrant, subpoena, or summons, not stop officers from accessing public areas, and answering questions is up to the staff or patients. These updates come as a flurry of deportation efforts unfold nationwide as President Donald Trump doubles down on one of the hallmarks of his campaign. And as you heard, Governor Wes Moore shifting responsibility to Congress when it comes to immigration policy. So we're sitting down with two of Maryland's congressmen to talk about the issue. We'll hear from Republican Andy Harris in just a few moments. We begin with freshman congressman and former Baltimore County executive Johnny Olszewski. I asked him about his take on immigration policy and his recent no vote on the Laken-Riley Act. President Donald Trump signed that bill into law Wednesday. It will require federal officials to detain and potentially deport those in the country illegally who are accused of theft or violent crimes before they're convicted. Despite his vote on the bill, the congressman tells me he wants to see more action when it comes to violent criminals in the country illegally. Governor Moore says that this is something that Congress needs to address. This is a federal issue. How long will the people of Maryland have to wait for Congress to take action on that?
Look, I will tell you that from my experience as county executive, we believe that we had an obligation that, particularly in the cases of violent criminals, when ICE raised the issue to us about having more notice, we agreed. We said we want to make sure that if you have identified a violent criminal who is eligible for deportation, we want to make sure that we give you as much notice as possible within the confines of what both Attorney Generals of the state of Maryland have said about detention beyond court-ordered requirements. And so I think we did find that middle ground where we say we have no acceptance for, tolerance for people who are violent offenders. Who are not here in a documented way.
Freshman Congressman Johnny Olszewski says right now there's a piecemeal approach in Maryland when it comes to immigration.
That in the case of a convicted violent criminal, that we want to find ways to make sure that we're following the law, but also supporting those public safety efforts. And so to the extent Congress can provide those clear guide rails and those clear guidance, we will do that. State and local governments, though, in the meantime, are able to, under current law, identify what the best approach is for them.
Should that change?
Look, I can only speak from my experience. Again, I think we struck the right balance where we were not penalizing people for nonviolent offenses, especially if they're just accused of but not convicted of. I think that we do have individuals who have been contributing to our economy and really strengthening our communities in a lot of ways, who may not be here with formal status. We have to weigh that against if you are convicted. It is a privilege to be here. If you are convicted of a serious offense, I think we have an obligation as local, state, and federal leaders to do what we can to keep our community safe.
While Baltimore County Executive Olszewski was criticized for his immigration policies. A Fox 45 News investigation revealed Baltimore County did not honor ICE detainers 70% of the time. Following our reporting, Olszewski changed the county's policies, now giving ICE 48 hours notice before releasing someone from detention who has a detainer. Can you explain why you voted against the Laken-Riley Act when that is dealing with people accused of committing violent crimes who are here illegally?
Well, I think it actually is a great precursor back to the conversation we were just having. What happened to Laken-Riley was awful. As the father of a little girl, I think that the perpetrator of that act is one of the most heinous human beings that exists. He should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and if not in jail, should be immediately deported. So in the case of that legislation, it does two things that were problematic for me. One is that it goes after individuals who are just, including children, who are just accused of, perhaps arrested for, but not actually convicted of any crime.
President Donald Trump signing the act into law Wednesday. Congressman Olszewski points to what Democrats call an unfunded mandate as another reason why he voted against the plan. So you would support a piece of legislation, hypothetically, that would target the people who are here without documentation, convicted of a violent crime?
Yeah, and I think that's, again, where I think that was the approach I tried to take as a local leader in terms of our interactions with ICE, and I think that is the kind of common sense, common ground, middle approach that Marylanders expect and that Americans expect.
Should we see you introduce such bill?
There is a small gap in the current law that allows for perpetrators of domestic violence, if they're sentenced to a small sentence, to not be eligible for deportation. And so we are actively working on a piece of legislation that would address that gap.
48 Democrats joined Republicans in voting for the Laken-Riley Act. Of Maryland's 8 representatives, 2 voted in favor. That includes House Freedom Caucus Chairman Andy Harris and Democratic Congresswoman April McClain Delaney. The 6 other members of Maryland's congressional delegation voted against the bill. Fox 45 News reached out to each of them, asking for an explanation of their vote. Congresswoman Sarah Elfreth's office responded in a statement saying, quote, she believes that Laken-Riley Act violates the long-established principle of due process, punishing those merely accused and not convicted of crimes. Additionally, the legislation exploits a tragedy for political gain. Congressman Jamie Raskin's office shared his comments on the bill on the House floor. In those comments, the congressman says, in part, this bill fails to take any meaningful action to improve our broken immigration system and to prevent crimes like this from occurring again. The family of Kayla Hamilton was in Washington, D.C. when President Trump signed the Laken-Riley Act. Hamilton was sexually assaulted and murdered in her home back in 2022. A teenager in the country illegally from El Salvador was convicted and sentenced in her murder last year. Fox 45 News spoke with Hamilton's mother following the bill signing yesterday. On Wednesday, she says that she hopes this law will prevent any other mothers from feeling the pain she feels.
I can hear Kayla saying to me, go, Mom, go, you know, and I know she's really proud of the fight that I've been doing and trying to make change for, you know, not only her memory, but also for those that have been affected by the border and also keep it from happening to someone else.
Maryland's sole Republican Congressman Andy Harris joins us live now. Thank you for being here with us, Congressman.
Certainly.
So there were several executive orders that I want to talk to from the president that he signed when he first took office. I want to start with the order to end birthright citizenship. We know that that is temporarily blocked by a federal judge at the moment. Do you agree with the Trump administration on that?
I do. I think ultimately the Supreme Court is going to have to make a decision on it, but pretty clearly the amendment that's used to justify birthright citizenship was after the Civil War. It was really to make sure that the children of freed slaves were given the rights of citizenship, and I think it's been abused recently by illegal immigrants crossing the border specifically to have their children here to get them the rights of citizenship.
So how exactly would that unfold? Do you envision, if it does move forward and the Trump administration is successful in the court, that the end of the birthright citizenship, would that be retroactive? Do you envision it being moving forward for the people who qualify or wouldn't qualify?
Well, I think that's all up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's going to have to make that decision whether it can be retroactively applied. I suspect it will be prospectively applied, but it's important. I mean, the bottom line is we have to stop giving people incentives to come to this country illegally, and that's one incentive they have.
Now, we know that ICE is touting the number of daily deportations. They're putting out graphics on social media looking at the numbers. Do you think the Trump administration is focused more on the number of deportations rather than the people who are actually being deported and looking at their criminal records?
Well, the administration has made it clear that their top priority is to get those convicted criminals and those the people who commit criminal acts in the United States, get them back to their to the countries they came from that sent them here. That's their priority, and it's pretty clear from the people they're deporting that that's their priority right now.
How do you feel about what's called collaterals, other people who may not have been convicted of violent crimes who are ultimately swept up in these ICE enforcement actions that we're seeing play out across the country?
Well, right now, the majority of Americans agree that if you came to this country illegally, you probably should be deported. So again, the priority is to get the criminal element. But again, if there are collateral people swept up who are in the country illegally, I think they should leave the country. And if they want to come in under the legal processes we have, that's fine. But they should go back to their home country.
In Maryland right now, where there's a conversation in Annapolis, push to protect churches, schools, hospitals, other than these sensitive locations from immigration enforcement. If that bill passes, would you view that as impeding federal immigration orders since the president rolled back those protections?
I do think it would be, and I suspect that there's the possibility that under federal law that prosecutions could occur because you are not supposed to impede federal action. You don't have to cooperate with it, but you can't impede it.
So if the legislature, the General Assembly, passes that plan as it's being proposed right now, do you think that that would be enough to threaten federal funding if the administration views that as an impediment?
I think the administration has made it clear that they are not going to cooperate and fund jurisdictions that don't cooperate with them on the deportation policies of the administration. And so I suspect that Maryland would be penny wise, pound foolish to do that. Maryland has a $3 billion budget gap, and I don't know why they'd want to add to it by threatening federal funding.
All right, Congressman Harris, I appreciate your time. This conversation far from over, obviously. All right, the Attorney General's guidance on immigration enforcement getting sharp criticism from law enforcement leaders. The Carroll County State's Attorney joins us live to talk about why he called it, quote, downright dumb. The Attorney General's office released guidance for state law enforcement officers when it comes to immigration enforcement. It includes instructing officers not to ask about immigration status during routine police work and tells them not to share personal information with federal immigration authorities without a warrant, among other things. Carroll County State's Attorney Haven Shoemaker responding with his own guidance, listing the ways law enforcement can cooperate with ICE. His guidance includes honoring ICE detainers and holds, partnering with ICE on joint task forces, and sharing information about immigration status when an immigrant is arrested for a crime, among other things. State's Attorney Haven Shoemaker joins us live now. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about this.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I apologize. You talked about the guidance from the Attorney General's office, especially when it comes to not honoring ICE detainers, downright dumb. What made you say that? It's pretty strong words.
Well, you know, I read his 27-page guidance, and I found that it was couched in language that seemed to be calculated to either dissuade or deter law enforcement officials from cooperating with federal immigration officials. And, you know, I wanted to remind my law enforcement folks here in Carroll County that the AG's opinion is just that. It's an opinion, and it's advisory only. So, and it seemed to me that, you know, he skirted over, let me refer to it here, federal law 8 U.S.C. Section 1373A, which prohibits local and state governments and agencies from enacting laws or policies that limit communication with ICE. So, I mean, I wanted to start with that. And, you know, what I said was dumb is the fact that, you know, his guidance doesn't explain how cooperating with federal immigration officials just isn't plain common sense. And I cited in what I issued the case of Rachel Moore. You know, and her alleged killer, of course, was from El Salvador, been deported down there 3 times, and there was a change in policy from the feds that, you know, kept him in, I guess. And guidance, it seems to me, that discourages, and that's what we had from the Attorney General.
Let me ask you this.
Local law enforcement officials from cooperating with ICE just doesn't make any sense at all.
I want to ask you, when we look at Maryland's policies, there is not a statewide policy for how local law enforcement should work with ICE when it comes to these detainers. Do you believe that without the guidance from the top, whether it's from the governor or from the General Assembly, does that create more confusion and make it more difficult for local law enforcement agencies to really find the best plan forward here?
Yeah, I mean, you know, ideally, there should be a uniform policy, but I think that uniform policy needs to recognize that provision of the United States Code that I referenced, that, we shouldn't enact policies that preclude officials from communicating with ICE.
This conversation is going to continue. Some of these executive orders from the White House are being challenged in court. We'll see what direction the General Assembly takes as this session unfolds. I appreciate your time this evening, State's Attorney Haven Shoemaker. I look forward to continuing this conversation in the days and weeks to come.
Thanks for having me.
Mixed messaging on President Trump's order allowing ICE in sensitive locations like schools and churches. We press one state lawmaker on what's really happening on the streets. One of President Trump's immigration orders allows ICE agents to go into sensitive spaces like schools and churches. Immigrant advocacy group Casa Maryland addressing that order today.
ICE has no place in our school. Today, we are facing an all-out attack in our immigrant families. We have seen this before: mass deportations, ICE raids, children ripped from classrooms, families apart, and students left too terrified to even show up for school.
However, in an interview with Fox 45's Rebecca Pryor, Maryland ICE Director Matthew Elliston says there has been a flood of misinformation surrounding that executive order.
So to be clear, since that executive order went into effect, you have not been in any schools in Maryland?
No, we have not been in any schools. We have not targeted any children. It is the most wild misconception I've heard in my almost 20 years in this job.
But you're hearing random reports and people are calling you saying
I'm getting them every day. Every day I'm on the phone with county executives and legislators asking the questions because that's what they're being told. I got forwarded an email from one of our county executives alleging that we were on an elementary school campus interviewing children. We weren't even in that county that day.
I spoke with Democratic State Delegate David Moon about those concerns, pressing him on what action he thinks the state should take on the issue. Do you believe that protecting these so-called sensitive locations is appropriate given the calls that we're seeing from the White House and the federal policies and the push coming from Washington?
No one wants to see convicted violent criminals hanging around in our communities. Nevertheless, we don't want to be traumatizing children by having aggressive enforcement activities happening outside of schools. Our hope with that kind of legislative discussion is whether you can have a reasonable discussion about these things where we're not unnecessarily traumatizing people who have done nothing wrong.
If there are people who have done something wrong, though, in those locations, do you think that it would be appropriate for ICE to come in and detain them for deportation?
ICE is certainly able to do so already. So again, this is again just a hope from the state that we can be reasonable about where these activities are going to occur. So I think again, no one's trying to impede the enforcement that the feds are allowed to do, but hopefully we can draw some reasonable lines about where these take place.
There was a recent poll done in January that showed the majority of Marylanders support local law enforcement honoring ICE detainers. And if that's where the people of Maryland are, why wouldn't the General Assembly follow suit?
I can't predict what the General Assembly is going to do this session. So again, I think a lot of the devil's in the details, and hopefully through this legislative session, we can begin to develop some consensus around exactly what we should be doing here.
Immigration will continue to be a major discussion on the state and national levels, and we will continue to follow the developing story and hold elected leaders accountable. That's all for this week's edition of Fox. I'm Mackenzie Frost. Mary?
Nearly 48 hours after the Key Bridge collapse, we are learning some major details about the cargo ship that crashed into it and the loss of life.
The bodies of 2 of the 6 missing people were found in the water today. They are 35-year-old Alejandro Hernandez Fuentes of Baltimore and 26-year-old Dorlean Ronial Castillo Cabrera of Dundalk.
Now, the NTSB says there's hazardous material from the cargo ship leaking into the water, creating a sheen on the surface. Take a look at this. Our harbor camera caught the sheen just yesterday.
Officials say 56 containers had hazardous materials inside of them. That included flammable substances and lithium-ion batteries.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Mary Bubala.
I'm Kai Jackson. It is important to note no local leaders addressed the hazardous materials in the water during any of their updates today. Fox 45 News will demand answers from them about that in the days ahead.
But that was just one of 4 major updates from the NTSB today. We also learned the NTSB is reviewing data from the Voyage data recorder, which leaders say is different from like a black box on an airplane. NTSB Chair Jennifer Hamady says the VDR gives much less data than a black box, also known as an FDR.
An FDR would give you 1,000 parameters. That's not this. VDR is basic. It is a snapshot of the major systems on a vessel. And we have long wanted more recording, more parameters to be recorded on a VDR. So that's hopefully something that we can provide.
The NTSB also reviewing data from that recorder. It expects to have a preliminary report in 2 to 4 weeks, a full report in 1 year to 2 years from now. Now, we also learned the bridge was in satisfactory condition at the time of the collapse. Its last fracture critical inspection was in May of 2023.
The bridge is fracture critical. It's a fracture critical bridge. What that means is if a member fails, that would likely cause a portion of or the entire bridge to collapse. There's no redundancy. The preferred method for building bridges today is that there is redundancy built in, whether that's transmitting loads to another member or some sort of structural redundancy. This bridge did not have redundancy.
Hamady says the board has also requested information on peer protection on 4 MDTA bridges. Fox 45 News has pointed out the Key Bridge did not have any fenders or anything protecting its supports. Now, the NTSB says it's looking into reports that power on the ship had been a problem before it left the port. Officials are also looking into whether tainted fuel could be part of the problem.
As part of any investigation by the NTSB, we look at the fuel system. We collect a sample of the fuel. In this particular situation, it would be marine diesel fuel, but we still have to do that. That sample will be taken, and we will analyze the quality, any sort of contaminants. We'll look at viscosity. That'll be part of our investigation.
The NTSB also provided a timeline on what happened early yesterday morning with the data from that Voyage data recorder. The data the ship shows entered the Fort McHenry Channel, as they're calling it, by 1:07 a.m. Alarms started sounding and going off on the deck of that ship at 1:24, and the VDR, the Voyage data recorder sensor stopped recording, but audio continued. At 1:26, the VDR resumed recording sensor data, and there were steering commands and rudder orders on the audio that were heard. Now, the ship's pilot also called for tugboats in the area to assist and told the MDTA duty officer about the blackout. At 1:27, the pilot ordered the anchor to be dropped and issued a radio call reporting the ship had lost all its power and was approaching the bridge. At that time, MDTA data shows 2 units on each side of the bridge were ordered to close traffic to the bridge. That's police officers with the MDTA. At 1:29, the VDR recorded the sound of the ship hitting the bridge. Shortly after that, the pilot reported the bridge was down. It was traveling at roughly 7 knots or 8 miles an hour in the water at that time. The NTSB says it still has to determine the exact time the ship hit the bridge. The NTSB says it interviewed the ship's captain and the first mate, along with some engineers. The pilots will be interviewed tomorrow.
We know a Mayday signal was sent moments before the crash, keeping drivers away from the area. But Governor Moore says first responders did not have time to alert all of the construction workers on the bridge before it collapsed. Only one person was able to make it off the bridge in time.
one of the survivors who I had the opportunity to speak with, one of the things he mentioned to me was as he was moving off of the bridge and literally saw the bridge fall right after he moved off, it was because it was a first responder who was telling him to move off of the bridge.
Well, tonight we have team coverage as recovery efforts continue.
We begin with Keith Daniels and the long healing process ahead for the victims' families. Keith?
Live from WBFF TV in Baltimore, this is breaking news.
Fox 45 is following breaking news out of Towson, Baltimore County. Baltimore County police say at least one person is dead, 9 others hurt after a mass shooting at the Johnson Fosbrink Funeral Home. That's on Lock Raven Boulevard, almost straddling the Parkville neighborhood. Police believe this was a targeted incident and there is no threat to the public at this time.
Officials also say a car drove into the home and caught fire into the funeral home. Right around 7:15, multiple victims have also been taken to shock trauma in Baltimore. You can see ambulances arriving at the bottom of your screen there tonight. Thanks so much for staying with us. I'm Maxine Stryker.
And I'm Kai Jackson. Now tonight we have team coverage as Fox 45's Jeff Abel is at the scene and Keith Daniels is at shock trauma.
Dr. Tyrone Powers also standing by, but we begin with Jessica Babb in Towson, where we just heard from police moments ago. Jessica, what are you hearing?
Saeed's fate is in the hands of a Baltimore City judge who will decide if he'll go back to prison for the murder of Haven Lee.
The defense arguing to reduce Saeed's sentence under a Maryland law allowing people who committed crimes as a juvenile to seek an early release. The judge will issue a written decision in the coming days. Good evening, I'm Maxine Stryker.
And I'm Kai Jackson. Today's hearing comes just one day after Baltimore City State's Attorney Ivan Bates withdrew a motion to vacate Saeed's conviction, meaning Saeed's murder conviction will stand.
Let's take a closer look at how we got here. Marilyn Mosby filed a motion to vacate Saeed's murder conviction in September of 2022, on the same day as her pre-trial hearing for her federal fraud and perjury trial. Just days later, Judge Melissa Finn, she granted Mosby's motion and set Saeed free after more than 20 years in prison. The Lee family appealed that decision, arguing that Mosby violated their rights by not giving them enough notice to attend that hearing in person. The case went through lower courts over the next few months, but ultimately the Maryland Supreme Court ruled the conviction would be reinstated in August of 2024. That put the case back in the hands of Baltimore City State's Attorney Ivan Bates, who addressed his decision to withdraw the motion to vacate today.
We have a duty as prosecutors to pursue justice and as officers of the court to address the false and misleading statements in the state's legal filings, which we take extremely seriously. I did not make the decision to withdraw this motion lightly, but it's necessary to preserve the credibility of my office and maintain the public's trust in the justice system.
The city state's attorney says Mosby's original motion included false and misleading statements. He laid out his argument in an 88-page document. Jeff Abel will join us live with a closer look at what this revelation could mean for former Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby, coming up in a few minutes. Our team coverage begins with Rebecca Pryor and what happened in court today.
Hanging his head.